corporate job wants full access to medical records. So I have lupus. When I got this job in 2020, I disclosed my disability status. It was never really an issue because I was remote until this May. Heat makes lupus symptoms worse and can even cause neurological events. My manager told me to have my doctor send a letter to the HR department stating that I should work from home should temps be above 85 F. I commute over an hour via public transit. I just got an email saying I need to sign a release to make the company a HIPAA exemption so they can talk directly to my doctor and access my medical records. I'm not signing it, and my manager supports me working from home when I need to. But this feels so super sketch to me. I have no problem disclosing my condition to HR, but will not give them permission to dig around in my private information. I have mental health conditions, medications that the company has no right knowing. Am I crazy? I'm not asking for any time off. Just for a reasonable accommodation when necessary. Edit. I am a woman who works in tech. This is a white-collar company. I am a mid-level specialist whose work could be done 100% remotely. No, you are not crazy. And your medical condition is protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. They have to reasonably accommodate you. And working from home is reasonable. You do not need to provide them access to your medical records. A letter from your doctor explaining that you have a disability is enough. They do not need signed HIPAA release forms. That's an overreach. I just got an email saying I need to sign a release to make the company a HIPAA exemption so they can talk directly to my doctor and access my medical records. Absolutely not. There is no reason on earth that an employer needs this information to make any kind of decision about your employment, accommodation or otherwise, that is beneficial to you. Your employer having access to and knowing this kind of information about you can only be used to hinder, hurt you, not help. Can't change my mind. Not required by law. Total BS. They're phishing. From the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Requests from your employer can ask you for a doctor's note or other health information if they need the information for sick leave, workers' compensation, wellness programs, or health insurance. However, if your employer asks your healthcare provider directly for information about you, your provider cannot give your employer the information without your authorization unless other laws require them to do so. Generally, the privacy rule applies to the disclosures made by your healthcare provider, not the questions your employer may ask. See 45 CFR sections 160.103 and 164.512. B. 1. V. And OCR's frequently asked questions. For employer issues, contact Department of Labor, 866. 4 USA Doll Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, 800. 669-4000. Source. From JAN, Job Accommodation Network, which provides free, confidential technical assistance about job accommodations and the Americans with Disabilities Act. ADA. What can employees do if they think a request for medical documentation is improper? If you think your employer is asking for more medical documentation than allowed, you should not just ignore the request or refuse to provide the information without letting your employer know why. Under the ADA, if an employee does not provide sufficient medical documentation as requested, the employer does not have a duty to continue the accommodation process. If an employer believes that an employee failed to provide documentation without a valid reason, the employer may be justified in refusing to provide an accommodation. So, it's important to go on record that you're challenging the request for medical documentation rather than flat out refusing to comply with it. If you decide to challenge a request for medical documentation, how do you do it? There are a couple things you might consider doing. One is to have your healthcare provider write a letter in support of your accommodation and just provide the medical information you believe is required. You can then give the letter to your employer along with your own letter stating that you believe you have provided sufficient documentation. We have the following publication: Practical Guidance for Medical Professionals. Providing sufficient medical documentation in support of a patient's accommodation request. If your employer asks you to sign a release so the employer can send questions directly to your health care provider and you think the release is too broad, you can try changing it before you sign it. Another option is to put something in writing to your employer before you ask your healthcare provider for documentation. Here are some ideas about what you might include. This is not intended to be legal advice. Acknowledge your receipt of the request for medical documentation. State that you understand that you must provide sufficient documentation and are willing to do so. Explain which part of the request for medical information doesn't seem to fall under the ADA rules for sufficient documentation. Ask your employer for clarification about why this information is being requested. Offer to meet with your employer to discuss the situation further if you're comfortable doing so. Refer your employer to medical documentation you previously provided if you believe you already provided sufficient documentation. If you need additional information about medical documentation under the ADA, or if you would like to discuss your accommodation request, please feel free to contact Jan. Source: I'm not 100% on the law where you are, but from what I know, both the US and Canada are very anal about medical privacy. You can't be compelled to give up medical information you don't want to unless it's specifically to a doctor assigned to treat you, or if you are remanded to state care, i.e. jail, institutionalized, or join a government military branch, insomuch as they need access to medical records to know what is appropriate treatment for you. And even then, a certified doctor will be making the observations themselves rather than randos. In short, give HR the finger. You'll provide them a doctor's note if they don't believe you, but you don't need to sign a release. And if they fire you in retaliation, that's wrongful dismissal, and you can get a pretty hefty payout for that, specifically because they're demanding confidential medical history. Do not sign any form. I've handled ADA accommodations at work, and I've never asked for unfettered access to an employee's medical records. I do not require that kind of access to do my job or provide an accommodation. What I do is have the employee take an accommodation form to their physician and have them fill it out. This will include the following information. 1. The nature of the disability and how it prevents the employee from performing the essential functions of their job. 2. The reasonable accommodations we can take that would allow the employee to perform the essential functions of their job. 3. Permission to speak to the doctor's office regarding the disability and the accommodations recommended. This information is not stored in an employee's personnel file, and the only part shared with the manager is the reasonable accommodation that must be made. There is absolutely no reason for anyone at your company to have full access to your medical records. They can legitimately ask if it's okay to speak with your physician about this specifica accommodation request, but they don't need access to any information not directly related to the accommodation request. You're not crazy. They're asking too much. Maybe you should also talk to a lawyer in advance, just in case you will be terminated in the future. Having a good lawyer at the ready will help you not to panic in such an event. I'd be willing to sign over access to my employer for the following conditions from the moment I sign the paper. 1. My job duties will be assigned by myself. 2. My job site will be assigned by myself. 3. My job hours will be assigned by myself. 4. My pay rate may not be reduced without my explicit approval, including via the effects of inflation. 5. Termination of my employment can only be made with my approval. 6. A notice of access must be made to me by the company prior to obtaining medical records directly. Failure to notify me via the properly filled out form I will provide will result in a payment for each instance. I will set the amount of this payment as I determine for each instance. What did I miss? You are not nuts. And I completely empathize. I'm a fellow lupus patient. And from June to November is the hardest time of the year for me. No one but you, your doctors, and your insurance need access to your medical records. If they see how many specialists you see, what you see them for, what you are on, etc., they will find some reason you cannot do your job. You will be legally edged out. If your job can be done from home, fight to keep it that way. Maybe bring up photosensitivity as well? It can be so much worse in the summer. Fight for your reasonable accommodations. You are worth whatever it takes to keep you safely, comfortably, healthily. Is that a word? It is today. Employed. I wish you the best of luck. I'm saving space in my heart for you. Candle 4-leaf clover white heart. You're not crazy. They have no legal right to the information. All they are entitled to is a description of any limitations or accommodations that are necessary. You're not even required to tell them you have lupus. If they push, say that you'd prefer they speak with your lawyer because their insistence on getting private, protected medical information makes you uncomfortable. HR should know better. But bringing up a lawyer should make them realize how wrong they are for pressing you. This is super sketchy. Don't sign anything. I agree with the first commenter. This is time to get a disability lawyer. It wouldn't cost much to have them send a letter to your HR department politely explaining the laws. THR reason to get a lawyer now is so that you can avoid battles and push back from HR that wants to bully you. Post in legal advice, that will help more so than here. This seems ripe for an ADA attorney. I am not a lawyer. I had a former employer ask me to sign permission to access my medical records and talk to my doctor at any time. I asked why. I was never going to sign. And they couldn't even think of a reason. Tears of joy. I had this same issue when I was doing my ADA paperwork. The HR person wanted me to sign and give them access to my medical records. I told them no. They shouldn't need access to my medical records if my doctor is filling out paperwork, verifying and confirming the condition. They are just nosy, and counting on you not reading the paperwork before you sign it. HR still approved my ADA accommodations without access to my medical records. You're being reasonable. You can limit the disclosure to only the things you approve. It doesn't have to be blanket approval. As everyone else said, absolutely not. I also have a disability. You are protected by the ADA. A signed doctor note, and that's all they need. They have no right to demand more. And you're protected by HIPAA as well. Your employer has no right to call and ask questions about you or your condition. HR is not your friend. Always remember who they work for, and it's good to be suspicious.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Ericast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.